The street was quieter than usual, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of flickering streetlights. A cold wind swept through the alley, rustling discarded newspapers and cigarette butts that danced like ghosts in the shadows. It was just another typical evening in the city, until it wasn't. A car screeched to a halt at the corner, tires biting into the wet asphalt. The headlights cut through the darkness, momentarily blinding anyone who dared glance at them. The doors slammed open and 3 officers emerged, their black uniforms swallowed by the night. They were hunting, but their prey wasn't the usual suspect. It was someone who looked like any other man walking down the street, except for one thing: his skin. David could feel it before they even approached him. The tension in the air thickened like smoke, seeping into his lungs. He'd been here too many times before, the fear bubbling beneath his skin, the sweat clinging to his back. The sirens had become background noise to his life. But tonight, there was something different, something sharp and predatory in the way the officers were moving. "Hey!" one of them shouted, his voice gruff, harsh. "You there!" David froze, his heartbeat quickening as his feet felt suddenly too heavy. He didn't look back, didn't dare. But they were already closing in. "Turn around," another officer barked, and this time, the command was unmistakable. It wasn't a request, it was an order, and orders were always followed. He turned slowly, his eyes locked on the ground, trying to suppress the rising storm in his chest. They were too close now. He could smell the sweat and cheap cologne that clung to their uniforms. "You're under suspicion," the first officer said, his hand already reaching for David's shoulder, spinning him around. The fingers that gripped his arm were rough like steel, bruising his skin. David didn't speak. He didn't need to. The words that followed didn't matter. He knew what they were. Words like suspicion, dangerous, criminal. The same script played out every time, but this time, something was different. Something was wrong. One of the officers cuffed his hands behind his back before he could protest, pushing him harshly toward the squad car. The world tilted for a moment, his vision narrowing as the cold steel of the handcuffs dug into his skin. "Let's get this over with," the officer muttered, barely looking at him as they shoved him into the back seat. The door slammed shut, sealing him inside, the engine roaring to life. David's breath hitched in his chest as the car pulled away, the city lights streaking past, distant and cold. In that moment, a sickening realization swept over him. The game was always rigged. They had made up their minds before they even laid eyes on him. He was already guilty in their eyes. It didn't matter that he hadn't done anything wrong. It didn't matter that his entire life was being crushed under the weight of suspicion, under the weight of the system that never seemed to care. But tonight, something was going to change. He didn't know how, he didn't know when, but he could feel it. The storm was coming, and it was coming for them all. The car screeched to a halt again, this time outside a dark, unmarked building. The doors flew open, and the officers moved with precision, dragging him out and forcing him into the building, their hands on him like vultures. He could taste the cold bitterness of fear rising in his throat, but he refused to let it consume him. "Move," one of the officers growled, his grip tightening. David's mind raced, his heart pounding louder than his feet hitting the ground. The night felt alive around him, suffocating, closing in on him with every step he took. Something was about to break. Something was about to crack. And he was going to make sure it wasn't him. The building was cold. David could feel the chill biting through his thin shirt as they dragged him through the sterile, unforgiving halls. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an eerie, unnatural glow that only seemed to make the walls press in closer, suffocating him with every step. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat pounding with the weight of 100 thoughts. His body moved, but his mind was somewhere far away, suspended in a haze of disbelief. The door at the end of the hall swung open, and they shoved him inside a small concrete room. The walls were bare, save for a single metal chair bolted to the floor in the center. There were no windows, no pictures, no anything to break the suffocating monotony of the room. It was a place designed to break people down, to strip them of their dignity and hope. The officers didn't even look at him as they locked the door behind him and left, their footsteps fading into the distance. The silence that followed was oppressive. For a moment, all David could hear was the sound of his own ragged breathing, as if his lungs were fighting for air in a place where even breathing felt like an act of defiance. He didn't know how long he sat there, staring at the floor, the cold metal of the chair pressing against his legs. His wrists were raw from the handcuffs, and his mouth was dry, like sandpaper. It was a familiar feeling, the helplessness, the powerlessness. But this time, it was different. The fear, the shame, the confusion, they were all too much to bear. The door opened again, and this time, 2 officers walked in. They were silent, their expressions unreadable, their movements deliberate. One of them was the same officer who had shoved him into the car, his face cold and unfeeling. The other was taller, broader, with a thick neck and a harsh scowl that never seemed to leave his face. David looked up at them, meeting their eyes for the first time since the arrest. They didn't speak immediately. Instead, they stood there, looking at him as if he was something beneath them, something they couldn't even be bothered to acknowledge as human. The taller officer, the one with the scowl, stepped forward, his boots heavy on the concrete floor. "Get up!" he barked, his voice low and menacing. "Now!" David hesitated, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. His body protested, but he forced himself to stand, his knees weak beneath him. The officer didn't wait for him to get his bearings. With a quick shove, he pushed David toward the metal chair in the center of the room. "Sit." David obeyed, his body sinking into the chair, the cold metal biting into his legs and back. He didn't know what was coming next, but the sense of dread that had been building in his chest since the moment they arrested him had grown to unbearable levels. He was trapped in a nightmare, one that felt all too real, and there was no way out. The taller officer paced in front of him, his eyes never leaving David. "You know why you're here, don't you?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're here because people like you don't belong. People like you don't get to walk freely through the streets without suspicion, without a reason." David clenched his fists, the blood rushing to his hands as his fingers curled into tight balls. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat, strangled by the raw emotion flooding his chest. It wasn't just the words that choked him, it was the truth in them, the horrible, ugly truth. The officer continued, his voice growing louder, more venomous. "You think you're entitled to the same respect as everyone else? You think you're innocent? All you are is a statistic, a danger to the people around you. You don't belong in this city, and you never will." David's heart skipped a beat. He knew what the officer was doing. He was trying to break him, trying to strip away whatever humanity he had left. The more he spoke, the more David felt himself shrinking, retreating inside himself, trying to protect what little remained of his pride. The officer leaned in closer, his breath hot on David's face. "You'll never be one of them. No matter how hard you try, you'll always be a threat, always be a criminal in their eyes. You're just a reminder of what this country doesn't want to see. A reminder that the system will always keep people like you in line." The words hit David like a slap, each one a blow to his already fragile sense of self. He wanted to fight back, to scream, to tell them they were wrong, but the words wouldn't come. He wasn't just a victim of their cruelty. He was a victim of the very system that had shaped them. The weight of that realization sank in, pulling him deeper into a pit of despair. The officer stood back up, straightening his uniform, and then turned to the other man, the one who had been standing silently by the door. The taller officer nodded, his eyes cold and calculating. "You know what to do." The second officer stepped forward, his hands moving with deliberate speed as he unbuckled his belt. David didn't understand what was happening at first. He couldn't make sense of it. But then, the officer's hand shot out, grabbing David by the jaw and forcing his head back. "Don't fight," the officer sneered, "or it will be worse for you." David's breath caught in his throat as panic surged through him. He could feel his chest tightening, his pulse racing. Every inch of his body screamed for escape. But there was nowhere to go. He was trapped, a prisoner in every sense of the word. "Please," David whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please, I haven't done anything wrong." The officer laughed, a low, mocking sound that reverberated through the room. "Wrong? No, you haven't done anything wrong, but you're a reminder of what's wrong, and that's enough. That's enough for us." David's heart pounded in his ears as the room seemed to close in around him. His vision blurred, the walls spinning as his world fell apart. The officers moved in on him, their hands rough, their faces masks of contempt. For the next few minutes, time seemed to stretch out endlessly. David's body was a battleground, his mind fighting to stay afloat in a sea of humiliation and fear. The officers had no mercy, no compassion. To them, he wasn't a man. He wasn't a human being. He was just another target, another casualty of a system that had already made up its mind. When it was over, when the officers finally stepped back and left the room, David was left broken. His body ached from the abuse, but it was his spirit that had been shattered. He sat there in the cold, silent room, his hands trembling at his sides. There were no tears. There was no strength left to cry. All that remained was a bitter, gnawing emptiness, a realization that the world outside these walls was just as cold, just as cruel. And that realization was more suffocating than anything the officers could do to him. As the door slammed shut once more, David sat there, staring into the abyss of his own reflection, in the cold, polished metal of the chair. The only thing left was the quiet, insidious whisper in his mind that told him what he already knew. They would never let him go, and in that moment, he knew, for the first time, that he was truly alone. Time passed slowly. Each tick of the clock on the wall seemed to echo in David's mind, growing louder with each passing moment, until it felt like it was the only sound that existed in the cold, sterile room. He had long since lost track of how long he had been sitting there. Minutes, hours, or days. It didn't matter. The darkness outside the narrow window told him everything he needed to know. The world was moving on without him, leaving him to rot in this concrete cage. The door to the interrogation room creaked open once more. The same officers who had humiliated him earlier stood in the doorway, their expressions unreadable, their stances unyielding. But something had changed. Something was different this time. They were no longer the faceless antagonists of his nightmare. Now, they were the architects of his despair. The weight of that realization pressed down on him, as heavy as the handcuffs that still chafed his wrists. The taller officer, the one who had spoken with such venom before, stepped forward first. His eyes never left David's face, not once. It was as if he were studying him, examining him for signs of weakness, for cracks in the armor that might allow him to take the next step in breaking him. David didn't speak. What was there to say? He had already tried pleading, tried reasoning with them, but they had seen him only as an obstacle to overcome, a problem to solve. To them, he wasn't a man. He was a threat, a symbol of everything they had been trained to hate, to control, to suppress. "Still here," the officer muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. He took a step closer, his boots heavy against the floor. "Thought you'd be crying by now, begging for your life. You must be tougher than you look." David's heart sank as he realized that the officer wasn't just mocking him, he was challenging him, testing him, pushing him to break. The cruelty in his words was clear, but what struck David the hardest was the familiarity. This wasn't just about the arrest, this was something deeper, something personal. The officer's partner, the one with the cold, detached demeanor, stood by the door, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a kind of indifference that only fueled David's anger. It was as if they had all become so accustomed to the pain they inflicted on others that it no longer registered as anything but routine. "Get up!" the taller officer barked, his words cutting through the thick silence like a whip. David stood slowly, his legs stiff and aching. His head was spinning, the adrenaline from earlier still coursing through his veins. But there was something else, something that hadn't been there before. There was a cold, simmering rage inside him, a fire that had been kindled by the officer's cruelty, their casual disregard for his humanity. "Move," the officer growled again, stepping aside to let David pass. David shuffled forward, the weight of the handcuffs pulling at his arms. The door clanged open, and they ushered him down the hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the cold corridors. It felt like a procession, a march to an uncertain fate. His stomach twisted in knots and his throat tightened. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but he knew it would be useless. They had already made up their minds. They had already condemned him. As they walked, the walls seemed to close in on him, the fluorescent lights above flickering sporadically, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. It was as if the very building itself was conspiring against him, pushing him deeper into this dark, endless hole. They reached another door, and the officer slammed it open, revealing a cramped, dimly lit room. Inside was a single table, a few chairs, and a large, imposing mirror mounted on the wall. It was clear that this was another interrogation room, one where the rules were different, where the only goal was to break a person down, to strip them of their dignity and their will. David was pushed into one of the chairs. The officers didn't sit. They stood over him, looming like predators circling their prey. The taller officer stepped forward again, his face twisted into a cruel smile. "Think you're tough?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. "Think you can survive what's coming next?" David didn't answer. His throat was dry, his voice trapped in his chest. But it didn't matter. The officer wasn't interested in an answer. He was interested in the power he held over David, in the way he could make him feel small, insignificant, worthless. The officer's hand moved, and before David could react, the slap came. It was sharp, sudden, and it rang out through the room like a gunshot. David's head snapped to the side, his cheek stinging from the impact. His eyes watered, his vision blurry for a moment. The force of the blow had stunned him, but it wasn't the pain that hit hardest. It was the humiliation. "You're nothing," the officer spat, his words dripping with contempt. "You don't deserve any better. You're just a nuisance, a reminder of everything that's wrong with this world." David's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't. To show weakness now would be to give them what they wanted. Instead, he clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay still, to maintain what little dignity he had left. But the officer wasn't finished. He leaned down, his face close to David's, his breath hot and foul. "You're not human in their eyes," he whispered, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You're just a thing, a target, a reminder that the system is doing what it was designed to do." David's stomach twisted, his body filled with a nauseating sense of helplessness. The officer was right. At least in the eyes of these men, he wasn't a person. He was a statistic, a problem to be solved, a body to be controlled. The taller officer stood up straight, moving back towards the door. "Get him out of here," he barked at the other officer, who immediately stepped forward to grab David by the arm. "Take him to the holding cell. I've had enough of this." David's legs felt weak beneath him as he was dragged out of the room, his mind reeling from the words that had been spoken, from the cruelty that had been inflicted on him. It was a cruelty that didn't just come from the officers. It came from a society that had long since dehumanized him, that had painted him as less than a man. As they passed through the halls, David couldn't help but notice the other officers, the ones who were sitting behind desks, making phone calls, drinking coffee. They didn't even look up at him as he was led past. To them, he was invisible. Just another person caught in the system. Just another body to be processed and forgotten. When they reached the holding cell, David was shoved inside. The door slammed shut behind him with a resounding clang, and for a moment, he just stood there, his back pressed against the cold, unforgiving bars. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as he struggled to regain some sense of control. He looked around the tiny cell. There was nothing. No bed, no chair, just a concrete floor and a toilet in the corner. It was a place designed for one purpose only, to break a person, and it was working. David sank to the floor, his back against the wall, his hands still trembling in the cuffs. He could feel the weight of everything that had happened crashing down on him. The humiliation, the fear, the realization that the system had already written him off. But even as the darkness threatened to swallow him whole, a part of him refused to give in. There was still a flicker of defiance inside him, a fire that refused to be extinguished. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if he would make it out of here alive. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let them break him. Not yet. The door to the cell slammed open, and the officer from earlier stepped in, his expression cold and emotionless. "Get up," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. David didn't move. He wouldn't. But as the officer stepped closer, he saw something in the officer's eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, of doubt, and for the first time since he had been arrested, David felt a spark of hope. Maybe they weren't as in control as they thought. Maybe, just maybe, the tide was about to turn. Let's take a brief pause here. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? Has anything in this story resonated with you? Or have you experienced something similar in your life? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to continue following the journey. Now let's continue. The air in the holding cell was thick with the smell of sweat and cold metal, a place where time stretched endlessly, like a never-ending nightmare. David sat in the corner, his back against the concrete wall, staring blankly at the floor. His body ached from the abuse, his wrists raw from the cuffs that had been left on for far too long. He had no idea how much time had passed since he had been thrown in here, but it didn't matter. Time didn't exist in this place. All that mattered was the weight of his own thoughts, the suffocating reality of what he was enduring. For the first time in his life, David felt the crushing weight of isolation. It wasn't just physical, though his body was bruised and battered, but emotional and mental. The isolation went deeper, a feeling of being disconnected from the world outside, from everything that had once been familiar. His life, once vibrant with hope and possibility, now felt like a distant memory. It was hard to believe that just a few days ago, he had been walking the streets, going about his business, unaware that this nightmare was waiting for him around the corner. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, sharp and deliberate, breaking the silence of the cell. David lifted his head, his heart racing as he prepared himself for whatever would come next. The door to his cell creaked open, and two officers stepped inside. The taller one, the one who had struck him earlier, gave him a cold, calculating look. The other officer, the one who had been more detached, remained silent, his expression unreadable. David stood slowly, his legs still stiff from sitting too long. He was exhausted, physically, emotionally, and mentally. Every fiber of his being screamed for release, for an end to the torment. But he knew, deep down, that it wasn't going to end. Not yet. The taller officer approached him, his eyes narrowing. "Still not talking, huh?" he sneered. "Thought you'd be begging by now. We're giving you a chance here, you know. But you're too proud, too stubborn. You think you're better than us." David swallowed hard, trying to ignore the bitterness that rose in his throat. The officer's words were meant to break him, to make him feel small, insignificant. But David wouldn't let them. He wouldn't let them win. Not like this. The officer leaned in close, his face mere inches from David's. "You think you can walk out of here with your head held high?" he whispered, his voice low and menacing. "You're nothing. You'll never be anything but a criminal in their eyes. People like you don't get second chances. You don't get to walk free." The words stung like venom, each one digging deeper, but David refused to show any sign of weakness. He stood tall, meeting the officer's gaze, his jaw clenched. His silence was his resistance. His refusal to break was the only weapon he had left. The officer stepped back, a twisted smile forming on his lips. "You're going to regret this. You'll see." He turned to the other officer, giving him a nod. The second officer stepped forward, his hands reaching for David, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him toward the door. "Move!" the officer ordered, David didn't resist. There was no point in fighting anymore. The battle had already been lost the moment he was arrested. His fight wasn't with them anymore. It was with the system that had created them. And that fight was much bigger than anything he could handle alone. The officers led him down the narrow, fluorescent-lit hallway, each step echoing in the silence, a grim reminder of where he was. The doors to the holding cells lined the hallway like cages, each one containing a person who had been discarded, forgotten by society. People like David, people who didn't fit into the neatly constructed world that others had built for them. They stopped in front of a small, sterile room. The officers didn't say anything as they shoved David inside. The room was even more depressing than the cell. No windows, no decoration, just 4 blank walls and a single, uncomfortable chair in the center. This was where they broke people. This was where they made sure no one ever forgot who was in charge. The door slammed shut behind him, and for a moment, there was only silence. But it was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, the kind that threatened to swallow you whole. David's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the chair. He knew what was coming. He didn't have to be told. The officers were going to humiliate him. They were going to degrade him until there was nothing left but an empty shell. They had already stripped him of his dignity in every way imaginable. Now, they would strip him of his pride. The door opened again, and the officers returned. The taller officer spoke first, his voice dripping with malice. "Sit," he commanded. David hesitated for a moment, his mind racing, but he obeyed. He sat down in the chair, his body aching, his hands still cuffed behind his back. The officers stood over him, their eyes cold, their faces devoid of any emotion. "You think you're tough?" the officer asked again, his voice mocking. "You think you're better than us? You think you're different because of the color of your skin?" David's heart raced. The officer wasn't asking a question. He was making a statement. He was reminding David of his place. "You think you're entitled to respect," the officer continued. "You're not. Not here. Not in this world. You'll never be more than a second-class citizen, no matter how hard you try." David felt the weight of the officer's words crashing down on him, but he refused to let them break him. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him crumble. He had already been stripped of everything, his freedom, his dignity, his sense of self. But they couldn't take his will. Not yet. The officer moved closer, his face twisting with disgust. "I think it's time we show you just how low you really are. Time to remind you where you belong." David's stomach churned as the officer's words settled in. He knew what was coming next. The humiliation. The degradation. It was always the same. They would make him feel like he didn't belong in this world, like he was less than human, and he would have to endure it because there was no other choice. But David didn't look away. He didn't flinch. He didn't break. He would survive this. He would make it through this, no matter how much they tried to tear him down. The officer's hand shot out, grabbing David by the chin and forcing his head back. "You're not a man," the officer spat, his breath hot and rancid in David's face. "You're just a problem, a stain on society, and we're going to make sure you remember that." David's chest tightened and his fists clenched. But still, he remained silent. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of hearing him beg. He wouldn't give them the power to break him. Not today. The officer took a step back, shaking his head in disgust. "You don't get it, do you?" he muttered. "You don't understand your place in this world. You're nothing. You're just a shadow, a ghost, and in the end, nobody will remember your name." David's mind raced, but his heart remained steady. The officer's words stung, but they didn't hurt as much as they once might have, because in that moment, David realized something. He didn't need their approval. He didn't need their respect. They could try to break him. They could try to make him feel small, insignificant. But in the end, they could never take away his humanity. And that, no matter what they did to him, was something they could never control. David's eyes were fixed on the floor, his body rigid in the cold chair. The room around him felt suffocating, like the air itself had thickened into something heavy and oppressive. The officers loomed over him, their presence filling the space with an intensity that was almost unbearable. Every glance, every word, every movement they made felt like a deliberate effort to chip away at what little dignity he had left. The taller officer, the one who had been tormenting him the most, stepped forward again. There was a cold smirk on his face, the kind of smile that made David's blood run cold. He could feel the officer's eyes boring into him, studying him, savoring the moment. It wasn't just about control, it was about dehumanization, about making him feel less than a person. "You're a tough one, aren't you?" the officer said, his voice oozing with contempt. "You think you're different from the others, huh? You think you're above all this?" David didn't respond. He had learned that responding, speaking, showing any sign of weakness would only encourage them. So, he remained silent, his jaw clenched tight. He had nothing left to say, and nothing to prove to them. The officer's words were nothing more than noise, designed to provoke, designed to break him. The officer's smile widened, and he took a step closer, his boots scraping against the floor. He towered over David, casting a long shadow that seemed to engulf him completely. "You see, that's the problem with people like you," the officer continued, his voice low and menacing. "You think you're special. You think you're entitled to respect, to be treated like a human being. But you're not. You're just a threat, a reminder of everything that's wrong with this country. And people like you," he leaned in even closer, his breath hot against David's ear, "are going to be kept in line no matter how hard you fight it." David's stomach churned as the officer's words sank in. The hatred, the venom, the disgust that dripped from every syllable. It was all too much. And yet, David refused to flinch. He refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him crack. But inside, the storm was raging. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. The mental and physical exhaustion was starting to take its toll. The pain from the handcuffs, the ache in his body from hours of abuse, the suffocating fear that threatened to overwhelm him. It was all starting to blur together, like a nightmare that refused to end. And yet, he held on, because that was all he had left. His resolve, his refusal to let them win. The officer straightened up and looked at his partner, who had been standing silently in the corner. There was a brief exchange of glances between them, a silent communication that David couldn't quite understand, but he knew something was coming, something worse. The other officer, the one who had been more detached, moved forward slowly, his face unreadable. He took a small step toward David and then stopped, standing just out of reach. For a moment, there was silence. It was the kind of silence that made David's skin crawl, the kind that always preceded something horrible. Without a word, the officer pulled out a folder from the stack of paperwork on the table, flipping it open to reveal a series of photographs. He didn't say anything at first. He simply held the pictures out in front of David, letting him see the faces of the people he had been associated with. The people they had decided were enemies of the state, people whose lives had been crushed under the weight of the same oppressive system. David's heart sank as he saw the faces, his friends, his neighbors, people he had once known, people he had once trusted. They were all in the photos, the people who had been dragged away, locked up, forgotten, the people whose names had been erased from the world, just like his own would be. He had known them, he had fought alongside them, and now they were just another part of the system's twisted game, another part of the system that had reduced them all to nothing but statistics, just like him. The officer's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and biting. "They've all been taken care of," he said, his tone smug. "They were too much of a risk, just like you. You think you're different? You think you're somehow exempt from this? No one is. Not you, not anyone." David's mind was spinning, but he refused to let the officer see it. His face remained impassive, his eyes blank. The pain was starting to fade into something else, something colder, something harder. He had seen the faces of his friends, his family, his people, and he had seen them reduced to this, to nothing, to criminals, to threats. But David wasn't done. He wouldn't let them break him. He wouldn't let them make him like them. The officer stepped closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "You're just like them," he said, his words sharp as a knife. "You're all the same. You're nothing but a stain on this country. And when this is all over, no one will even remember your name. They'll forget you, just like they forget the others. You'll vanish, like dust." David's breath caught in his throat. The words cut deep, deeper than he cared to admit. The officer was right. They would erase him. They would erase his name, his story, his existence. He would become another forgotten face in a long line of people who had been pushed aside and abandoned. But then, something inside him shifted. Something hardened, something defiant. The officer had underestimated him. He wasn't just another forgotten name. He wasn't just another statistic. And he would make sure they remembered that. The officer stood there, waiting for a reaction, watching David closely, savoring the moment. But David didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He stared back, his eyes burning with a fire that wasn't there before. The officer's smile faltered, just for a moment. But it was enough. David saw it, and in that moment, he knew. He wasn't done. The officer finally stepped back, the smugness in his face replaced by a flicker of doubt. It was brief, but it was there. The longer he stared at David, the more he seemed to realize that something was different. "You think you've won?" The officer spat, his face contorting with anger. "You haven't won anything. You're nothing." David didn't respond. He didn't need to. The officer's words were hollow, meaningless. He had nothing left to take from him. The physical pain, the emotional scars, they were just a part of the process. But David had something that they couldn't take. He had his mind and his will. The officer turned, his frustration evident, and walked toward the door. Before he left, he gave David one last venomous glance. "You won't last long," he warned. "We'll break you eventually." David's response was simple, but it was enough. "You'll never break me." And with that, the door slammed shut behind him, leaving David alone in the silence. But it wasn't a silence of defeat. It was a silence of resolve. David had been pushed to the edge, and though the darkness was closing in, he had found something inside himself that would never be extinguished. It wasn't over, not yet, and he wasn't going to let them win. Not now, not ever. The room was silent once again, and the silence felt like the weight of the world pressing in on David. His heart pounded in his chest, the rhythmic beat an incessant reminder that he was still alive, still trapped in this nightmare. Every inch of his body screamed in pain, the effects of the relentless torture, both physical and mental, still gnawing at him like a festering wound. But despite it all, something had shifted inside him. The fire that had been stoked earlier, the defiance that had flickered in the face of their cruelty, had now settled deep into his bones. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the knowledge that this was far from over, that the battle had only just begun. The door opened with a creak, and two officers stepped in. The taller officer, the one who had done the most damage to his psyche, was at the forefront. Behind him was the other officer, the one who had remained mostly silent, observing, detached. The taller officer's gaze was cold, his eyes narrow slits of contempt as they fell on David. The tension in the room thickened as the officers stood just inside the door, neither of them moving. They were waiting to see what David would do next, to see how he would react. It was a game to them now, a sickening dance of power and control, with David at the center, struggling to hold on to whatever humanity was left. "You think you've won something, don't you?" the taller officer said, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you're special just because you didn't break?" David didn't answer. There was no point in trying to explain himself. Words were useless. He had learned that much in the hours he had spent in this place, so he simply sat there, his hands still cuffed behind his back, his face impassive, staring straight ahead. The officer took a step forward, his boots heavy against the concrete floor. "You think you're better than us. You think your silence, your refusal to give us the satisfaction of seeing you beg, means something. But let me tell you something. He paused, his voice becoming softer, almost conspiratorial. It doesn't. You're still nothing in our eyes. Nothing. David's stomach twisted, a knot of anger and humiliation tightening in his chest. But he still refused to show any reaction. The officer was right about one thing. David was nothing to them. To them, he was less than human. A criminal. A threat. An object to be controlled, not a person to be respected. But in that moment, David realized that he had something they could never take away. His own sense of self. No matter how hard they tried, no matter how much they stripped away from him, they couldn't take that. "You don't get it, do you?" the officer continued, pacing in front of David like a predator stalking its prey. "We're not just here to break you. We're here to remind you of your place in this world. People like you, people of your kind, will never be free. You'll always be beneath us, beneath everyone else. And no matter how hard you fight it, no matter how strong you think you are, that's the truth. The only truth that matters." David's chest tightened as the officer's words hit him like a hammer. He had heard them before, countless times. On the streets, in school, in the stores. They were words meant to belittle, to break him down, to make him feel like he didn't belong. They were words meant to remind him that no matter how hard he tried, he would always be seen as less than human. And they had worked. For so long they had worked. But now, they no longer had the power to hurt him, not the way they once had. David slowly lifted his gaze, meeting the officer's eyes for the first time since they had entered. His eyes were hard, his face expressionless, but inside he was brimming with defiance. He wasn't going to let them win, not this time. The officer's eyes flickered with something. Surprise, maybe, before he quickly masked it with his usual contempt. "You think you're so strong," he muttered, turning to the other officer. "But you'll see, you'll break. Everyone breaks eventually. It's just a matter of time." The second officer, who had been standing by the door silently, stepped forward. He didn't speak, but his eyes flicked to the cuffs that still bound David's wrists. Without a word, he reached down and yanked David's arm roughly, pulling him to his feet. David staggered, his legs unsteady from sitting for so long, but he didn't fight back. He stood tall, though his body was trembling from exhaustion. The officer who had been speaking, the taller one, took a step back, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "We're going to take you to see someone," he said. "Someone who will really make you understand your place. We're going to show you exactly where you belong in this world." David's heart sank as the officers moved toward him, but he didn't resist. He knew better than to resist. They would hurt him more, and he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. He had to keep his head clear, his mind sharp. They marched him down the hallway, their grip on him tight, as though they were worried he might somehow escape. The silence between them was suffocating, broken only by the occasional shuffle of their feet on the concrete floor. The air around them felt thick with tension, like something terrible was about to happen. They reached a new door, different from the others. It was smaller, more guarded. The officers knocked twice before entering, and when they did, David was shoved inside the room without a second thought. The room was dimly lit, with a single desk in the middle and a man sitting behind it. He wasn't an officer, but he was someone who made David's skin crawl the moment he saw him. He was older, dressed in a sharp suit, his hair graying at the temples. His expression was cold, calculating, and his eyes, those eyes, were filled with a kind of ruthless intelligence that made David's blood run cold. "Well, well," the man said, his voice smooth and velvety. "What do we have here? Another one of them, I presume?" He didn't look at David as he spoke, his eyes still fixed on the paperwork in front of him. Another misguided soul who thinks they're entitled to a life they don't deserve. David remained silent, his body stiff with tension. This man was different from the officers. He didn't rely on brute force or insults. No, this man was far more dangerous. He played with people's minds, twisted their thoughts, manipulated them into believing they were powerless. He was the kind of person who didn't need to raise his voice to make someone feel like dirt. He could do it with just a few words. The officer behind David spoke, his voice low. He hasn't spoken a word since he was brought in. We think he's playing tough, but he'll break. They all do. The man behind the desk finally looked up, his eyes locking onto David's. There was something calculating in his gaze, something that made David's skin crawl. He smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You think you're better than them, don't you?" he asked, his voice soft but cutting. "You think you're different, above the rest. But the truth is, you're no better. You're just another cog in the wheel. Another black face that doesn't belong." David's heart raced in his chest, but he didn't respond. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. He had been through too much already, endured too much pain and humiliation, to let this man get inside his head. But the words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. They were meant to break him, to force him to see himself the way they saw him, as nothing. "You're not special," the man continued, his voice now tinged with mockery. "You're just another statistic, another person who will fade into the shadows, forgotten. Your story won't matter. Your life won't matter. None of it will." David's fists clenched. He wanted to scream, to shout, to tell them that they were wrong, but he didn't. Instead, he stood there, silent, knowing that his silence was his power. The man behind the desk leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "you've been given chances, opportunities, and yet you insist on resisting. But that's okay. We'll show you. We'll break you. We always do." David stood tall, his chest heaving with silent rage. He wasn't going to let them take away his dignity. He wasn't going to let them make him feel like nothing. They could do whatever they wanted to his body, but his mind, their manipulation, their cruelty, it wouldn't break him. "You'll see," the man said, his smile widening. "Eventually, you'll understand that you belong in this world the way we say you do. That's the truth, the only truth." David's gaze never wavered, his voice steady as he finally spoke. "I will never belong to you." The words hung in the air, and for a moment the room was still. The man's smile faltered, just for a moment. And in that fleeting moment, David knew. He wasn't broken yet. The room was cold, almost suffocating in its stillness. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting harsh, unflattering shadows against the walls. David's back was pressed against the hard concrete, his wrists still shackled behind him. His body ached from the prolonged physical abuse, his limbs stiff from being confined for so long. But even more than that, it was the weight of the psychological toll that weighed most heavily on him. The humiliation, the degradation, it had all piled up on his shoulders, and it seemed as if there was no end in sight. Yet through it all, something inside him refused to break. They had tried to tear him down. They had tried to make him question his worth, to make him feel small, insignificant. But David had learned something in these dark, silent hours. They could strip away his dignity, but they could never take away his spirit. As he sat there, his gaze steady, his mind clearer than it had been in a long time, David knew that this was the moment. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He had been pushed to the limit, mentally, emotionally, physically, and he could feel that the walls surrounding him were closing in. But there was a fire burning inside of him now, a fire that had been kindled the moment they had tried to strip away everything that made him who he was. The door opened, and the sound of heavy boots echoed through the hall, growing louder as they approached. 2 officers entered, their faces cold, unfeeling, like stone. They didn't say a word as they took their positions around David, standing tall and unmoving, as if they were nothing more than statues in a darkened gallery. Their silence was deliberate. It was meant to disarm him, to make him feel vulnerable, exposed. But David was no longer afraid. He had nothing left to fear. The taller officer, the one who had been his primary tormentor, stepped forward first. His eyes met David's, and for a moment there was a flicker of something in his gaze. A hint of frustration, maybe even confusion. It was brief, gone before David could even register it. But David saw it, and that moment was enough. "You still think you can win?" the officer asked, his voice mocking, dripping with disdain. David said nothing. He simply stared back at him, unblinking, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. They wanted a reaction. They wanted him to beg, to plead for mercy. But that would never happen. The officer smiled, a smile that was twisted with cruelty. You've been through so much already, and yet here you are, still silent, still pretending you're above it all, but you're not, you know. He took another step closer, leaning down slightly, so that his face was mere inches from David's. You're not special. You're nothing. You're just a black man who doesn't know his place. David's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding against each other. He had heard those words before. He had heard them countless times from people who saw him as nothing more than a stereotype. But they were wrong. They had always been wrong. He wasn't their version of nothing. He wasn't what they thought he was. I don't need your approval, David finally spoke, his voice steady, calm. You can try to break me. You can keep calling me names, but that doesn't change who I am. The officer's eyes hardened. You think you're some kind of hero? You think you're above us? You're just a product of the system, just like the rest of them. You think anyone cares about your story? No one cares. You're just another black man who's going to rot in here, forgotten. David's fist clenched tighter, but he kept his gaze steady. He was not going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter. The officer stepped back, seemingly more frustrated now. You don't get it, do you? You'll never leave this place. You'll never be free. You'll never escape the way the world sees you. David didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The officer had said all he needed to say, and David had heard it all before. The racism, the hate, the oppression. But it didn't matter anymore. Not now. The other officer, the quieter one, stepped forward now, his face cold and emotionless. His eyes flicked down to the shackles on David's wrists. Time to teach you a lesson, he said, his tone flat and impersonal. David knew what was coming. He had been through this before. They had broken him down physically, mentally, emotionally. They had humiliated him, tried to erase his sense of self. But now, it was different. Now, he wasn't afraid anymore. He had nothing left to lose. Without a word, the officer moved to undo the shackles on David's wrists. David stood there, his body tense but still, knowing that this was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when he could show them that they couldn't control him. The officer finally removed the cuffs, and David flexed his hands, feeling the relief in his fingers. He took a deep breath, and then turned his gaze back to the two officers, who were watching him closely, as if waiting for him to crumble under the pressure. But David wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. Do your worst, he said, his voice low but full of conviction. I'm not afraid of you. The taller officer's face twisted into a snarl. You think you're in control. You think you can dictate what happens next. You're nothing but a piece of trash to us, and we're going to remind you of that. David's heart beat in his chest like a drum, but he stood tall. He could feel the weight of the officer's stares on him, the oppressive energy in the room, but it didn't matter anymore. He had made it this far, and he wasn't going to let them take his soul. Not now. Not ever. The taller officer took a step forward, but before he could reach David, the other officer spoke, his voice cutting through the tension. Enough. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The taller officer paused, his expression faltering for a moment, and turned to face his partner. What? He growled. We've pushed him enough, the second officer said, his voice strangely calm. It's time we let him go. David's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Let him go? After everything they had done? After everything they had said? The taller officer looked at his partner with confusion, but he said nothing. He just stood there, staring at David with cold, piercing eyes. David didn't know what to think. For a split second, he wondered if it was some kind of trap. A final attempt to make him believe he had won, only to crush him in the end. But something told him it wasn't. Something told him that this was the end of their game. Leave, the second officer said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. With a final disgusted look at David, the taller officer turned and left the room, his heavy boots echoing down the hallway. The second officer followed, leaving David standing alone in the cold, empty room. David stood there for a long moment, trying to process what had just happened. His body was exhausted, his mind still reeling from the events that had unfolded. But there was something else, something deep inside him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. He wasn't free yet, not entirely. But for the first time in a long while, David allowed himself to feel a small flicker of hope. Maybe there was a way out of this. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to survive this hell and come out stronger on the other side. For now, though, he was still here, still standing, and he wasn't going to let them take his spirit. Not now, not ever. As he took a slow, steady breath, he knew one thing for sure. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. David stood alone in the cold, sterile room, the air thick with the tension that lingered after the officers left. His body ached from the brutal hours he had endured, his joints stiff from the long hours in captivity. His face was swollen, his mind weary, but it was his heart that felt the heaviest weight of all. For a moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes, to breathe deeply and pull himself together. But the silence that had descended was anything but peaceful. It was the silence of a man who had been pushed to the edge, a man who had been broken down and tested in ways that most couldn't even begin to comprehend. The door creaked open, and David's heart skipped a beat, his body instinctively tensing. It was almost automatic at this point. Every sound, every movement, was a reminder that he was still trapped, that this nightmare hadn't ended. But when he turned to face the door, it wasn't an officer who stepped in. It wasn't someone there to hurt him. It was the man from the desk, the man who had stood behind that cold, calculating gaze, the one who had spoken with such chilling precision, who had looked at him like a specimen under a microscope, judging his worth before deciding whether he was fit to live, the man who had whispered in his ear that he would fade into nothingness. David stiffened. This man, this person who had looked at him like he was less than a man, was standing in front of him now, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression unreadable. The smooth, composed demeanor he wore was like a mask that David could see right through. "You're still here," the man said softly, his voice a strange mix of condescension and something deeper, something that almost felt like recognition, but it was distant, barely noticeable. David's mind raced. He was prepared for anything. Another round of humiliation, another test of endurance. But this wasn't expected. The man wasn't screaming, wasn't barking orders. He wasn't even looking at David with the same disdainful, calculating gaze. The man took a few measured steps toward him, his polished shoes clicking lightly on the floor. The room felt smaller with every step he took, as if the walls themselves were closing in, drawing them closer together. "You've been through a lot," the man continued, his tone oddly detached, almost clinical, like he was speaking to a subject he had studied for far too long. "Most would have broken by now. I would say I'm impressed, but you're not quite out of the woods." David didn't respond. He wasn't sure what the man wanted from him. He wasn't sure if he even cared anymore. "Do you understand what's happening to you?" the man asked, a subtle shift in his voice as he stopped just a few feet away from David. He studied David carefully, as though trying to read him, trying to find a crack in the armor. David's mouth was dry. His lips cracked open, but no words came out at first. There was a part of him that wanted to yell, to scream every insult he had been forced to swallow for hours, days, or however long it had been. He wanted to lash out, to tell the man that he was not the broken person they thought he was. But David knew better. He wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Finally, David spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what you want from me, but I'm not afraid of you." The man's lips twitched, the faintest smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. Fear is an interesting thing, isn't it? Some men use it to control others, but some learn to use it as a weapon for themselves. You see, David, fear isn't about weakness. It's about knowing when to use it. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, David wasn't sure if the man was trying to manipulate him, to toy with his emotions, or if he was genuinely trying to have some kind of conversation. But as the seconds passed, the silence between them grew unbearable, so thick that David could almost feel the weight pressing down on him. "Let me tell you something," the man continued, his eyes narrowing just slightly, as though he had a secret to share. "People like you, people who fight back, people who refuse to understand their place in this world, are dangerous. You're a symbol of defiance. And do you know what happens to symbols, David? They get destroyed." David straightened his back. The man was trying to provoke him again, trying to strip away whatever semblance of dignity he still had left. But it wouldn't work. He wasn't their symbol to destroy. He wasn't anyone's pawn. "You don't control me," David said firmly, his voice gaining strength. "You can take everything from me. You can humiliate me, break my body, my mind, but you can't take my soul. You can't take who I am." The man's expression hardened, and the subtle smirk disappeared from his face, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "You think you're strong, don't you? You think you're immune to the system, immune to what's been put in place to keep people like you in line. But you're not. You're just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. And no matter how much you resist, no matter how much you struggle, the system will win. It always wins." David clenched his fists, the muscles in his arms trembling slightly, but he didn't move. He wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing him sweat. "I don't need the system, and neither do the people who stand with me." The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving David's, his voice dropping lower. "You really don't get it, do you? The system isn't just something you can opt out of. It's something that's woven into the fabric of this country, this world. It's in the air you breathe, the ground you walk on. People like you, you'll always be beneath us. We'll always make sure you know your place." David's breath quickened, but he didn't show any fear. He wasn't going to let the man win. "You think you can erase me? You think you can make me disappear, just like you've done to others? But I'm still here. I'm still standing. And no matter how much you try to break me, you can't take away the truth. You can't take away who I am." The man's expression faltered, just for a moment. For the first time, David saw a flicker of something that looked almost like doubt, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by that same cold, indifferent gaze. "You're wasting your time," the man said, his voice still calm but carrying a sharp edge. "There's no room for people like you in this world, and when we're finished with you, no one will remember your name. You'll disappear, like all the others." David's pulse raced, his vision narrowing as his anger rose. They thought they could silence him. They thought they could erase him, just like they had tried with others. But he was more than just a name, more than just a face to be discarded. "I'm not going anywhere," David said, his voice strong. "And you won't erase me. Not now. Not ever." The man stared at him for a long moment, the silence between them growing heavier with each passing second. But finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. "We'll see." He turned abruptly, leaving David standing in the room, the weight of his words hanging in the air. David stood there, his body exhausted, his mind racing. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. David knew what he had to do now. He had to fight. He had to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been crushed under the weight of the system. They had tried to break him, but they had only made him stronger. And no matter what they threw at him next, he would stand tall. He would never give in. Because in the end, they could never erase the truth. And the truth was that he was still here, and he would always be here. The cold steel of the holding cell door slammed shut behind him with a deafening clang. The echo reverberated through the empty hallway, leaving David alone in the sterile, suffocating silence. His heart thudded in his chest, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He stood still for a long moment, his mind spinning, fighting to process the weight of the conversation with the man behind the desk. The words the man had spoken were like daggers lodged in his soul, but despite the pain, they also ignited something deep within him, a spark, a fire he hadn't realized had been kindling all along. He wasn't broken, not yet, not ever. The truth they tried to hide from him, the truth they wanted to make him deny, was still there, alive in the deepest parts of him, no matter how hard they tried to strip him of his humanity. No matter the brutal torture or the degrading insults, the one thing they could never take from him was the fire inside. The fire that burned with the truth of who he was, who his people were, and the strength that flowed through his veins. The door opened again, this time without a knock. 2 officers stepped inside, their faces blank, their eyes as cold as stone. They didn't need to speak. The tension in the air said everything. They were here to remind him that he was still beneath them, that they were in control. They had always been in control, and they would continue to break him down, piece by piece, until he was nothing more than a shadow of his former self. But David wasn't their victim, not anymore. The taller officer, the one who had made it his mission to crush David's spirit, moved toward him with deliberate slowness, his boots clicking against the concrete floor. David didn't flinch. He didn't take a step back. His eyes locked with the officer's, unwavering, refusing to show any sign of weakness. "You think you're untouchable," the officer sneered, his voice thick with contempt. "You think you've won something. You're still here because we let you be. You're nothing, just a small problem we've yet to solve." David didn't speak. He wouldn't dignify the officer's words with a response. He had already endured their cruelty, their threats, their attempts to break him. Words didn't matter anymore. Actions did. The officer stopped in front of him, close enough that David could feel the heat of his breath on his skin. "You still don't get it, do you? You're just a reminder of the problem we need to fix. A problem that will never go away, no matter how much you fight." David's hands tightened into fists behind his back, his body trembling slightly from the effort of holding himself steady. The officer was trying to provoke him, trying to get him to react, to break. But David had learned long ago that anger was just another form of control. They wanted him to lash out, to give them a reason to escalate their brutality. But he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. The officer's eyes flickered with irritation as he reached out, grabbing David by the arm and shoving him toward the chair in the middle of the room. David stumbled slightly but caught himself, not letting the officer see any sign of weakness. He sat down, his spine straight, his gaze fixed on the officer in front of him. The officer circled around him like a predator, studying him, waiting for the moment when David would finally crumble. "You don't belong here, you know that," the officer said, his voice almost gentle now, as if trying to lull David into a false sense of comfort. "People like you were never meant to be free. You don't deserve respect. And you never will." David's breath quickened, but he didn't break. He refused to show the officer how much those words hurt. He had heard them too many times in his life, from too many people who believed they were better than him simply because of the color of his skin. They had spent years trying to convince him that he was less than human, less than worthy of respect, less than worthy of being seen as a person. But they were wrong. He wasn't their prisoner. He wasn't their victim, and he wasn't going to let them define who he was. The officer's hand shot out, grabbing David by the chin and forcing him to look up. David's jaw clenched as the officer's grip tightened, but he didn't flinch. He wouldn't. "You think you're strong?" the officer hissed. "You think you can stand up to us? You're just a nuisance, an annoyance we have to deal with. And once we're done with you, you'll be nothing but a memory, an ugly memory that no one will ever remember." David's mind raced, his thoughts swirling like a storm, but he held on to one thing: his resolve. They could do whatever they wanted to his body. They could strip him of everything, his pride, his dignity, his freedom, but they would never take his soul. They would never take his will to survive. "I'll never be like you," David said, his voice steady, cold. The officer's grip faltered for a split second, the smallest hint of surprise flashing in his eyes before he regained control. He leaned in closer, his face inches from David's, his breath rancid with contempt. "You think you're different. You think you're immune to what we're doing to you. You're nothing but a broken man, waiting for us to finish the job." David shook his head slowly. "I'm not broken. I've never been broken." The officer's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening. He was silent for a moment, his gaze locked onto David's, as if searching for any sign of doubt. But David didn't waver. He couldn't. Not now. Not after everything. The officer stepped back, his eyes full of frustration. "You'll change. They all change. People like you always do." David didn't answer. He couldn't. The officer had already made up his mind about him, just as society had made up its mind about people like David for generations. But they didn't understand. They didn't know what it meant to fight for survival, to fight for dignity, when every system around you was built to crush you. The officer turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he paused, his back still to David. "I hope you enjoy this little victory of yours," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "because it's the last one you'll ever have." The door slammed shut behind him, and David was left alone in the room once again, the weight of the officer's words pressing down on him like a vice. But as the silence settled in, David felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He wasn't going to break. Not today. Not ever. He stood up slowly, his legs still unsteady, his body aching from the relentless abuse, but there was a fire burning inside him now. It had been there all along, flickering in the dark corners of his mind. But now it was fully alight, a fire he couldn't and wouldn't extinguish. David knew what he had to do. He had to survive. He had to endure. He had to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been crushed under the weight of this system. They could break his body. They could try to silence him, but they couldn't erase his truth, his strength. And he was far from finished. The officers had underestimated him. They had thought he would bend, that he would break under the pressure, but they hadn't counted on one thing, the fire within him. They hadn't counted on the resilience that lived deep in his bones, the unwavering strength that no amount of humiliation, no amount of brutality could ever extinguish. David's breath steadied, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose rise up within him. They wanted him to fade into the shadows. They wanted him to vanish, to be forgotten. But he wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't going to let them win. Not now, not ever. He wasn't just a symbol. He wasn't just a victim. He was a man. And no matter what they threw at him, he would stand tall, fighting for his life, his dignity, and his truth. Because in the end, they could never take that away from him. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. David stood at the edge of the small, dimly lit room, staring at the door where the officers had just exited. His body ached from the constant strain, but it was the weight of everything that had happened, the humiliation, the degradation, the feeling of being less than human, that pressed hardest against him. The echoes of their words lingered in his mind, reverberating in his skull like the beating of a war drum. They had tried to break him. They had pushed him, prodded him, insulted him at every turn, forcing him to face the darkest parts of himself. But through it all, there was something they never understood. Every blow they struck only made him stronger. Every insult, every cruel word only stoked the fire inside him that refused to be extinguished. David's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. His breath was shallow, and for a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight of everything he had endured. But only for a moment. He couldn't afford to lose himself in the sorrow. He couldn't afford to let them see him break. With a deep breath, he straightened up, his eyes hardened with determination. He had come too far to turn back now. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something bigger. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his humanity, and showing them that no matter what they did, they could never take that away from him. Not ever. The door to the room opened once more, and the tall officer entered again, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't make a move to drag David back into the endless cycle of torment. Instead, he just stood there for a moment, watching David closely. David's gaze locked with his, and this time, the officer faltered. For the first time in all their interactions, there was a flicker of doubt in the officer's eyes. David saw it clearly, the briefest hesitation, the smallest crack in his composure. It was as if the officer had come to realize, perhaps for the first time, that David wasn't like the others. He wasn't someone to be cowed into submission. He wasn't a broken man. "You think you've won?" The officer's voice was quiet, almost unsure. "You think you can walk out of here with your head held high?" David didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. The officer's words, once designed to tear him apart, no longer had any power over him. He wasn't here to be anyone's puppet anymore. He wasn't here to be anyone's idea of a statistic or a symbol. He was here for himself. "I don't need your approval," David said finally, his voice calm, steady. "You can't break me. You can't take away who I am." The officer opened his mouth to speak, but something in David's unwavering gaze stopped him. The words died on his lips. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, with a deep breath, the officer spoke again, this time with something different in his voice. "You'll never be one of us. You'll never be equal to the rest of them." David's heart tightened at the officer's words, but he wasn't about to let him see the effect they had on him. He wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of watching him squirm. "No," David said, his voice firm and resolute. "I'll never be like you. But I don't need to be." The officer's eyes darkened, and for the briefest second, his face twisted with something that could almost be called recognition. He turned on his heel, walking toward the door, but as he reached it, he paused and glanced back at David one last time. "You think you're the first one to try and fight this system?" he asked, his voice quiet but harsh. "You think you're the first one to stand up to us, to try and change things? They all try, but they never make it. Not in the end. They all get forgotten." David didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, his fists still clenched, his jaw set with quiet defiance. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his words simple, but filled with the kind of conviction that would echo long after the officer left. The officer didn't answer. He didn't need to. With a curt nod, he turned and left the room, the door slamming shut behind him. But this time, David didn't feel the usual wave of fear and dread. This time, he felt something different, a sense of finality. For so long, he had been nothing more than a shadow to them, a name they would erase, a face they would forget. But not anymore. This time, he had taken control. This time, he had shown them that no matter how hard they tried, they could never take his spirit. They could never take his humanity. David stood there for a moment longer, breathing deeply, trying to collect his thoughts. But there was something else in the air now, something he hadn't felt before. Hope. It wasn't just a fleeting feeling. It was a fire that burned deep in his chest, a fire that would drive him forward no matter the odds. It was in that moment, standing alone in that small, dimly lit room, that David realized the truth. He had already won. He had survived. They hadn't been able to break him, no matter how much they tried. The battle wasn't over, but the war had already been won. He turned away from the door and walked to the far corner of the room, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The small flicker of hope that had ignited within him began to grow, burning brighter with each passing second. The fire inside him was now ablaze, a force of will and determination that no one could put out. He wasn't just a victim of the system. He wasn't just another statistic. He was a man, and nothing they did could ever take that away from him. David knew that there was still a long road ahead, that the battle was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a chance, like he had a purpose. He wasn't going to just survive. He was going to change things, and they wouldn't be able to stop him. As he stood there in the quiet of the room, the door to his future cracked open just a little wider. It wasn't much, but it was enough, and in that moment, David made a promise to himself. He would never stop fighting. Thank you for following this journey. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What do you think about David's struggle and the challenges he faced? Have you ever encountered moments of racism in your own life? Your comments are incredibly important to us, and we value each and every one of you who takes the time to share your thoughts. If you enjoyed the story, please consider subscribing and giving us a like. Your support means the world to us. We hope you have a great day, and if you're still with us, drop a comment with the phrase, "Strength in Silence." That way, we'll know you're listening until the very end. Thank you again,